Hello everyone, it's Elizabeth from The Smart Stitcher. In this week's tutorial I'm going to show you how to freehand sew the top of your tassel together. The method for getting your tassel ready is exactly the same as the method we used in my previous tutorial where we were hole punching and sewing with a braid, except this time obviously we're going to be using a needle and thread. Please make sure before you start this kind of tassel that you do have a thimble ready for the end of your finger, and that the needle you choose to use can easily go through the leather that you plan to use, because you don't want to damage your fingers. In this tutorial I'm going to be using a betweens number 5 because that works quite nicely and goes through my leather quite easily. I'm also using a Gutermann's Mara thread, so it's smaller and narrower than the braid. It's Mara, M-A-R-A. But it goes through the top of the leather and the tassel very easily to sew it together with. I wouldn't want to be freehand sewing with a really thick braid because I might have to sort of make a hole beforehand. So I've just got a betweens number 5 with my Gutermann's Mara thread, and that's what I'm going to be using to sew up, and I'll be waxing this. Any strong thread will do, so it doesn't have to be this particular make or brand, but anything that is going to be able to hold itself together and to draw the leather together without snapping it can be used. So if you've got thread at home, go for it. I've prepared my tassel in much the same way that I did when I was preparing my previous video and I was going to punch the holes to sew some braid through to bring the collar of the tassel together. This time I've done exactly the same, but I'm going to be hand sewing the leather together. I've prepared the tassel exactly the same way as I've done before, and I shall make sure that that tutorial is linked so you can see how to do that. I've then got the leather that I wish to use as my collar. I've already pre-measured it and cut it to size, so my ends just about meet, and I'm going to pull them together with the hand thread that I'm using. Before I start sewing, I'm just going to glue my sort of collar around the top of the tassel. I want the sort of center back of my leather collar here to go against the seam line where the tassel was wrapped round itself, so that'll go at the back, and that means that then I've got a nice sort of clear path to the front so that I can then bring my edges around nice and carefully. I'm going to be gluing the sort of center section of my sort of collar section, and I'm also going to be gluing around the seam and then wrapping them together. I'm going to be careful not to get too much glue around the top because I don't want to spend lots of time rubbing that off, and then we are going to start sewing. So my collar is glued into position and I've made sure that the top is nice and level with the top of my tassel. I've now got probably about 50 to 60 centimeters of thread in my needle. I'm using quite a strong sort of sewing thread for this, so when I completed the previous tassel we were sewing with a braid which was a bit thicker, which is why we pre-punched the holes. With this particular project I'm just sewing by hand, and I'm going to be eyeballing where my thread will go, so I don't want to necessarily have a really thick thread to pull through. I'm going to start off by tucking my needle just inside the collar and from underneath, coming from the inside to the outside, and I want to be sort of quite close to my base, so I can bring that up for you to see. I've come out and I'm going to leave a little bit of a tail. Now when I stitched with the braid I started with a knot to sort of secure my thread. This time I'm actually going to leave a sort of tail hanging because I'm actually going to show you how to tie your knot at the end. So I'm now going to go across to the other side and I'm going to go in roughly the same position, and I'm going to come out again through that first hole that I've made. So always check before you start a project like this that you can actually push your needle through by hand. I'm wearing a thimble because that's going to protect the tip of my finger, and I'm just pulling that nice and tight. So I'm now going to start sewing. I'm going to put my needle in, and I'm going sort of to start working my way up. And how that's going to work is I'm going to go in on this right hand side, but I'm traveling to my left, come out again, go in and out, and I'm going to repeat that all the way up. So I'm going to eyeball probably about every ½ centimeter or so, and I want to keep my needle sort of coming out in the right place, and it's just working that out by eye. So I'm going to walk along and pop that up. You could, if you wanted to, use a light bit of pen and just mark out where you want your stitches to go. If you're feeling really confident, you may wish to eyeball it. I would recommend not having your stitches right on the edge of the leather, because if the thread pulls through, it's going to be really frustrating to have to fit a new collar. So I'm going to work my way up, and I'm just pulling them nice and tight. I'm trying to not overstretch and sort of really force it together. I just want the edges to come and to sit nicely together. As I'm working my way up, I'm also shaping the tassel head by hand, and I can obviously at the very end do any sort of final bits of shaping, but I just want to make sure that I'm happy with how everything is coming together, and I'm going to keep working my way up to the top. So I've reached the top, and I've just eyeballed out, so my sort of very top stitch is fairly close to the top of the tassel, because I don't want the sort of the edge of the collar to sort of catch on anything. I'm going to repeat that final stitch just a couple of times, going through the same holes that I've just created, and that's going to secure the sort of the very top of my tassel. So again, I'm just taking care not to sort of really wrench everything and pull it tight, because I don't want to pull anything out from the and sort of split the leather at all, but I do want to make sure that I've got a nice sort of firm top and bottom. So I'm then going to just work my way back down now, coming through the same holes, so that I'm going to be creating a sort of cross effect on the way back down. So they're going to overlap, and we're just going to repeat that stitch pattern but coming back down the other side of the tassel. So I'm going to work my way down. This is very, very similar to the previous video when we were sewing with the braid, exactly the same sort of method, and we're just going to work our way down to the bottom and then finish the thread off. So I've now reached the bottom, I've come back down, and I've completed all of my stitches. I'm going to take my needle through, and I've already made a sort of my stitch across the bottom there, but this time I'm going to start like I'm going to do another stitch, but I'm going to bring my needle out underneath so that it slides under the collar and just comes out the bottom. I'm now going to tie a knot to finish my thread off, and this can be your choice of knot, granny knot, reef knot, whatever you prefer, because I'm then going to slide the thread back under the collar. So the first one, second one, whoops, let's get round, and one more for luck. And then I'm going to, because I haven't glued where the collar has come together, I know that I can slide my needle up underneath, and we're going to pull it out the top. Now sometimes this can be really handy just to have a pair of pliers nearby so that you can grab the needle and pull it out. So I'm going to just see it coming out the top there. I'm going to grab the tip with my pliers, and we're going to pull it out nice and carefully. Check that the tail hasn't caught round any of the other bits of fringe. And as I'm pulling it out, I'm sort of pulling it into the tassel itself, so the knot's hidden. I'm going to keep it under a little bit of tension, and I'm going to just snip the thread off as close as I can, and that will sort of then sink back into the leather a little bit more. Now in order to get rid of the tail, I'm going to do exactly the same again. So when you leave your tail, it's always a good idea to leave at least 10 centimeters or so, that you can then thread back through to finish off and to hide your knot. If you find that your thread decides it's going to shred, you can just sort of re-wax it a little bit and then pop it into the needle. So we just make sure that's nice and flat, and in we go. So again, the second one, I'm now just going to repeat that. I'm going to slide the needle underneath that top layer, making sure that we come out, so we're coming out near the top there. Let's get that in. This is where your thimble's really handy, and then we're just going to pull that out nice and carefully. There we go, and then pull it right underneath, so the knot is now nice and secure. I'm going to again just keep it under a little bit of tension. You'll notice I've come out just slightly in sort of one of my stitches. That's absolutely fine. keep it under a bit of tension, snip it off nice and close, and because my collar started to distort a little bit, I'm actually just going to snip off a little bit of that top of the collar there and just sort of level it off a little bit more to finish my tassel off. So just very, very carefully. I don't want to cut my stitches. You might find that using a scalpel is quite nice to do that with. There we've got our finished tassel. Now just one last little bit of finishing to help that knot sit nice and smoothly. I'm just going to very, very gently hammer it. So again, if you need to use a little leather barrier to make sure that you don't damage your tassel, then please do so. Just make sure that you don't then injure any part of what you've done or damage your stitching. So just a little bit of a barrier there, and that just helps to flatten the stitches out. You can then, once you've flattened it, just sort of wiggle it about, pull off any last sort of final bits and pieces of leather that have sort of got in the way, get rid of any fluff, and there we have our completed tassel with our freehand stitching. Happy stitching, everyone.